Well, you talked a little bit about like world building earlier, but like in terms of what you focused on the most for the entire series, like you had the kind of the people, some of the location, but like what did you really do like in terms of layering, I guess, is what I want to know, for the first three in particular, and then the second set, because to me it's always interesting to see how somebody starts the world building, but then really like kind of builds off from there.
Yeah. So I guess I start with location, what is it like there? And then I think of, okay, here's a character. How do they react in that world? Okay. And then you take another character. How do they react in that world? And I guess that's how I start to layer the world building,
Hmm.
you know. And like I like to write in third person. And I think when you're initially building a world, you kind of have to hop around a little bit in different characters' heads because they don't all see it the same way.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then once I guess you've established your protagonists and everything, you can stick with them. But for me, it was always about having realistic settings and having unusual things happen in those realistic settings.
Mm.
You know, like it's a realistic setting. That first series is all, even the second series, they're all very accessible settings, but with completely different situations. When society collapses, we're so used to communicating, with our technology and everything and all of that. What happens when that's gone? What happens when the electricity's gone? When we can't communicate, we can't check, in the second series, they can't check the weather before they go out on a boat. We're so used to being able to check what's the weather today. It informs what we wear and everything. What if that was taken away? Like we're communicating. We're so far apart, but look at us.
Yeah.
What about if all news broadcasts end? Mid broadcast, it ends and you're left in the lurch. How does that affect the choices you make in that new world that you find? It's the same world, it looks the same, but suddenly there's this whole layer that's been stripped back. And I guess that's what I did.
Yeah.
And then with that world building, how do the characters bring their past experiences? Like the girl Madeline, she's walking through, and they're not walking, they're creeping through these streets of Lura, underneath these blossom trees, and it reminds her of the same tree in her grandmother, her nana's front yard that she used to sit under, and that allows her to recall a memory about how to mourn. How do you mourn for how to, and a conversation she had with her mother about, why do you wear black for 40 days when you're mourning? Why would you do that? We're in Australia now. Stop doing that. And her mum goes, but for me, that's the way I do it. That gives me a time to start and a time to end. And so that world around her gives her a different perspective. And so it's, for me, the world building is not just about the place, but about the characters and that interaction and how they interact with it and how their past makes them interact with the world and it shapes the world. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's how.
I think that's really good. There's really great advice in there too, because I think it makes total sense. Mm, when we talk about it, I think sometimes like when I've discussed this with students for writing and stuff, like
Mm.
I've tried to explain to them like why would you write the same story from different people's perspective, right? Even if they start in the same location, right? And we've been really trying to get them to understand, particularly with history, right, with these enduring issues, that like depending on whoever three people you have at whatever time or where they're from, whether it's geographically or socioeconomically, gender, whatever, like they're going to be different, right? And they're going to have different perspectives and they're going to be treated differently. they no matter where they're at, right, or what time. So I think it's a really important thing, I think, particularly for world building to, really consider, right?
Mm.
And I think it's interesting when you're talking about post-apocalyptic, right? And then like making these changes. So to me, I've always find that interesting about, everybody does those things with post-apocalyptic, somewhat differently. And it's always really interesting, I think, the worlds that kind of shake from the destroying
Yeah.
of ours, as we know it. But yeah, I think it's always interesting to see where people come from in the world building process. So that's super cool.